Good morning, and welcome to this session on Science for Cultural Relations, Past, Present, and Future, which is organized by the British Council. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, the Royal Scientific Society, for organizing this World Science Forum at the Dead Sea here in the beautiful area in Jordan, and also the British Council for organizing this session, which I believe is quite important for the region in particular, which we are living in, and the time, of course, in history, which we are also witnessing with all this intercultural rift between the two sides of the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. My name is Abdelhamid El-Zuhairi, and I'm the president of the Euro-Mediterranean University, which is called IMUNI in Slovenia. And I have the pleasure of moderating this session. Just let me take you through very quickly how we're going to have the session. We're going to listen to the speakers, which I'm going to present right away. And then after their interventions, we will take some questions from the audience and try to discuss the session, as I said, is past, present, and future. The past is going to definitely be presented by the speakers, some examples of science or cultural diplomacy. And the present will also be touched upon. Hopefully, the future, we will be able to arrive at some good ideas and initiatives through our discussions with you. So I would like to urge you to please listen carefully to the speakers and try to think of what we need to discuss. I'm sure there are a lot of topics that we could touch upon in our discussions, and this will hopefully give us enough material to develop our recommendations for the session. So we will first hear from Daniel Corbell. He's the Global Head of Science for the British Council in the UK. And like I said, the British Council are the organizers of this session. And then we'll hear from Claire McNulty. She's the Senior Director of Programs and Explorer Development Europe at the National Geographic Society in the UK. And then we'll hear from Michael Gilmont, and he's the Research Fellow in Water Security, University of Oxford, together with Erica Harper from the WANA Institute. And finally, we'll have a video message from Michael Byers, a professor and Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Daniel to the stage. Please, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Hamid, and good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. And yeah, I mean, it's my first time in Jordan. It's been fantastic so far. The World Science Forum has been excellent. I'm noticing a certain level of fatigue. It's Friday already, but I hope we'll still have a great discussion amongst this slightly smaller group, perhaps. So I wanted to use the next 14 minutes or so to give you my perspective on what we at the British Council would call science for cultural relations. And I'll illustrate this concept using 3 examples of our science-related work. And then conclude by sharing with you 6 lessons I have drawn from our science programming. But before I do that, I wanted to say a few words about who we are and why we are involved in science. And the British Council is the UK's international organization for cultural relations and educational opportunities. And we operate at arm's length from UK government. And this gives us a degree of independence that shapes how we work with state actors and non-state actors. And we were founded in the 1930s, partly in response to the rise of fascism in Europe at the time. Today we have offices in over 100 countries across the globe, and many of you will be familiar with our English language work and our global network of libraries. But this is not all we do, and indeed in our Royal Charter it says we are being encouraged to cooperate or help support cooperation between the UK and other countries through culture, education, science and technology. But just going back to the first point, what on earth are cultural relations? And there's an ongoing debate about what this term should cover, could cover, and whether it sits within cultural diplomacy or public diplomacy. And the fountain of all knowledge defines cultural relations as reciprocal, non-coercive, transnational interactions between two or more cultures, encompassing a range of activities that are conducted both by state and non-state actors within the space of cultural and civil society. And the Wikipedia entry goes on to list a number of cultural relations outcomes. But if I was to distill these down to what I think is the essence of cultural relations work, then this would be creating friendly knowledge and understanding between countries for long-lasting mutual benefit. And I think this is a really, really important element, the long-lasting mutual benefit. And that may, depending on how you view that, set it apart from shorter-term, more instrumental science diplomacy or diplomatic efforts. But it is, as I said, an ongoing debate. And we believe that the natural sciences, as well as social sciences and research and humanities, are really excellent vehicles to work in this space, even, or I should say maybe in particular in the presence of significant political and diplomatic challenges. So let me share with you my 3 examples, and let me start with Russia. So despite significant ups and downs in official relations between the UK and Russia, British Council has been physically present in Russia without interruption since the mid-1950s. And via the Soviet Relations Committee, we brokered the establishment in 1959 of a cultural agreement between the two countries. And this is basically this has really enabled us or it has formed the basis from which to develop scientific exchanges throughout the Soviet period and also beyond. And we were able to capitalize on the great tradition of scientific endeavor Russia can be so proud of. Unfortunately, the UK's formal relations with Russia took a major hit around 2008, 2009, and this ultimately also affected our work at the British Council. We did manage to bounce back fairly quickly, though, and since then have gradually built up an ever increasingly ambitious program of science-related work. And actually, at the peak of the 2008 crisis, we started exploring with Russia, or with the Russian cultural sector or sphere, how we might very visibly link up our two countries via a scientific anniversary of really great importance, that of the first manned space flight. And so Yuri Gagarin was the cosmonaut who did that. And Yuri Gagarin, so in the words of his daughter, Elena Gagarina, this day, the 12th of April 1961, was one of the most remarkable days in history, uniting all people in all countries and all continents, in brackets, via science and technology. And we felt that commemorating this monumental achievement would be an excellent starting point for more work in the science space. So Yuri Gagarin himself visited London back in July 1961, so just a few months after he had come back to Earth. And we managed to get his daughter, Elena, to London 50 years later. At the time, she headed the Kremlin Museum, so this is also part of this link that we had in country to the cultural sector. So she came to London and revealed a statue of her father, and this was kindly donated by the Russian Federal Space Agency. So that was a really significant kind of symbolic gesture, I suppose, also from the space agency. And the success of this event really helped us to rebuild trust via the science space, and allowed us, and also our long-standing UK partners, I guess most notably the National Science Museum and the Royal Society, to do much more in this space. So in 2014, against the backdrop of yet another diplomatic crisis with Russia about or because of Crimea and Syria, we ran the UK-Russia Year of Culture, and in the wake of that, we helped to broker links that ultimately allowed the Science Museum's Cosmonauts exhibition to go ahead. And this exhibition displayed for the first time ever outside of Russia Soviet-era space exploration gear, including the spacecraft flown by Valentina Tereshkova, the first ever woman in space. So that was a fantastic achievement. It was a massive exhibition as well, and really, really successful. And I guess viewing it from 2017 now, the culmination of this work, of this kind of trajectory of our work with Russia, is this year's UK-Russia Year of Science and Education. And we're leading on this as an organization together with our embassy in Moscow. And as part of that year, we and our many UK partners are running a huge range of activities, of exhibitions. We're also funding some research collaborations between the UK and Russia, and also facilitate some policy dialogues on science diplomacy. So really, I think that's symbolic of the growth of trust as well. And I think this, to get there, to get where we're now with Russia, I think it took a lot of patience, and we had to be in it for the long run. And I think that's one of the most essential elements I wanted to highlight today, that being in there for the long run. And we worked with the right partners in the UK and in Russia, very gradually building trust via the totality of what we do in the cultural space. So not only science, but also our work with other museums and so forth. And we also very visibly celebrated Russia's achievements. So not only our own achievements, but also Russia's achievements, and what these mean to us as a country and globally, the wider world. So I think these are kind of ingredients that I feel were important in getting to where we're at now. The second example I wanted to outline today is our work with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And obviously Iran has a very rich tradition in the sciences. And to this day, Iran generates outstanding research. But this is of course a huge asset to the country. But I think the great potential that lies in international collaboration has yet to be unlocked fully with Iran. In particular, when we think about the shared challenges that have guided us through this week here in Jordan. So we currently don't have an office in Tehran. So our work with Iran has to be coordinated from our London office mostly, and this is always more challenging than having presence on the ground, which would give us much more direct links to society there. However, I think working in a very controlled and measured manner with a small number of individuals, or individual researchers, individual universities, individual research institutions, we've managed to pool some financial support and in-kind support to run a series of workshops that I'm listing here for early career researchers, both from Iran and from the UK. And some of these workshops were supported financially by Iranian universities, and one of them, one of the water workshops, the global health workshops, was actually held in Iran as well. So currently, I'd say our work is beginning to gain some tractions compared to where we're at in Russia. This is really early stages. But as a direct result, I'd say, of one of these water workshops, where we and Imperial College London are putting together, or have put together, a bit quite an ambitious, larger project on water, involving 5 universities in the UK and institutions from 7 countries in South Asia, but then also including Iran. So I'd say that currently our work with Iran relies on us working largely with individuals and non-state actors, such as individual researchers and universities. And these relationships need to be managed very carefully at the moment and nurtured, and to some extent from the bottom up. So we're working with the people who are actually going to do the research. And because rushing into trying to establish a formal state-sanctioned exchange program before really having demonstrated success and before having gained that level of trust, I don't think would be productive at all in this scenario. The final example I wanted to share with you is the UK's Newton Fund. Because in my view, the overarching design of the Newton Fund directly encourages cultural relations outcomes, long-term, mutually beneficial linkages between countries. And Newton is a 7-year sort of science support program, and it's worth £735 million. It's UK government funded, so funded by, sorry, I should bring that up. It's funded by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and you wouldn't think that from the title, but this is our science ministry. So it's funded by them. It covers 18 countries, so it's quite a big program, plus the UK. And it's delivered by a whole range of UK organizations, including the national academies, the 7 research councils, our innovation agency, Innovate UK, and also the British Council. But while the fund's primary aim is the promotion of economic development and social welfare through science and innovation partnerships with the UK. But I think the most unique thing about Newton is that there's a requirement that all participating countries co-own and co-fund the individual work programs. And this means that the fund, so in very practical terms, this means that the fund actually has an effective value of £735 million times 2. But it also means that currently the program works with over 100 actually, in-country partners, including funding agencies and individual universities, to ensure that every single activity is shaped not only by us in the UK, but also by our partners. So by really building that into the design of the program, I think we're hopefully generating this potential, at least for mutually beneficial linkages that have the potential to last as well, because it's a 7-year program. It will be over at some point, but we're hoping that these relationships at the government level, at the agency level, but then also researcher level, will generate something that hasn't been there to that degree before. I'm very pleased that Newton is now also coming to Jordan under the name of Newton Khalidi Fund. And that name is obviously chosen to recognize Dr. Usama al-Khalidi's contribution to science and technology in Jordan and the region. And also to show really that we're looking for true partnerships between the UK and Jordan. So let me just close. So all the information on Newton Fund can be found under this address. The department or the ministry has an office here. A person based here in Jordan as well. So if you're interested specifically in what's happening in Jordan, it's good to get in touch with them. So I just wanted to close by giving you 6 lessons about science for cultural relations I have drawn from our own work. So these aren't general learning points. These are my learning points, but I hope that they are interesting. So I think for us it's been really important to have physical presence in many of our countries, and that helps us, and then really invest in credibility on the ground, if you want to call it that, and be there for the long term. So if you look at the Russia example, that's really paid off. Gaining a deep understanding of the other side is also crucial. And I'm not sure why number 4 comes before number 3, but celebrating your partner's strengths and heritage in the Russia case, again, was important. But also when we work with Iran and really bringing out that it's not this often perceived as patronizing, unidirectional interaction with countries. We can all learn so much, and if we work together internationally in the science sphere, we know that this has more impact and it's mutually beneficial, as at least it has that potential. And yeah, building your programs on common strategies and shared legacies as well is hugely important. and working in partnership with other non-state actors, for us anyway as an organization, has worked out really well. The Science Museum bringing in the slightly more cultural angle to it, the Royal Society and other of the national academies. That's been hugely beneficial. So often, it depends very much on the context. Often it's better to come in not only as one organization and have a comprehensive offer. And finally, for us anyway, forgetting any one-size-fits-all approaches and remembering that science programming doesn't have to be limited to just research exchanges and collaboration. There can be part of that can come later, but there's also this whole cultural dimension that we mustn't forget. Thank you very much.
So I will give myself the right to just comment very quickly on Dan's presentation, because I think it's very important also maybe for all of us to just take note of some things that would come later in the discussion. Dan presented 3 examples of science diplomacy, science versus culture diplomacy. My opinion is very difficult to really, have a demarcation between science and cultural diplomacy. They are 2 faces of a coin, because without being culturally sensitive, and as Daniel very much proven, that you have to really have a deep understanding of the other, you have to celebrate others' achievement, you have to build trust and credibility. And this maybe is one very important issue dealing with Iran in particular. Countries that, and Russia of course, countries that do not enjoy right now with the UK good diplomatic ties. I also took note of this Newton Fund is one of the, I think, good instruments of showing how, because when we talk about science diplomacy, the question always pops up, is it bottom up or top down? And definitely it should be both. Newton Fund is a fund that is designed and built in a way to allow scientists bottom-up approach of scientist cooperation, but then you have to provide the right tools and instruments for them to cooperate. And a Newton Fund, what's interesting, it's called differently in different countries, having the other, like it's Newton, like you've mentioned here in El Khalidi in Jordan, it's Musharrafa in Egypt. So it also, this is a practical way of showing how you are celebrating others as well as you're working. And then one point which is very important is this co-fund and co-ownership. You have to allow for co-ownership, otherwise it's not sustainable. It's not aid, it's partnership. This is a very important point. I have others, but just to reflect on these points, shared legacies and common strategies is very important also when you're working in science diplomacy. Just these were points to reflect upon until we have our discussion later on. Now I'd like to invite Claire to give her presentation. You have a PowerPoint? Okay. So, where is it? Is it on the...
Thanks. So although until recently I was in Dan's position, he's now kind of taken the leads on that. But now I work for National Geographic. And I wanted to thank Dan for organising the session and the organisers of this conference as well, in a fantastic location. I've also got 3 examples, but I also want to just kind of talk to you a little bit about National Geographic. I'll just move that up a little bit. And tell you more about us, because I think when most people hear National Geographic, the first thing that they think about is the iconic yellow border of the magazine, which here is our cover from 1998, showing the wonders of Petra. But actually we started out as a kind of traditional scientific society. a group of men, and at that time they were all men, coming together, wanting to know more about the world, funding scientific expeditions and explorations to all corners of the earth. And then when they came back, they would write the reports of what they saw, and it would be compiled in quite a traditional, quite a dry-looking academic journal to go out to people. And then our president at the time, Alexander Graham Bell, who's in the front there on the right, he decided that it might be a good idea to put pictures in the report. And this caused a huge uproar. There were resignations across the board. People were saying it was dumbing down and that pictures weren't scientific enough. But he prevailed, and the kind of new National Geographic magazine was born. But over the years, as well as producing the magazine, what really is the core of what we do is the support that we give to the scientists, to the explorers around the world who are working to really understand the world, explore the world, and importantly, to protect it for the next generation. And this is an example of some of the explorers that we support today. This was one of our leadership programs. You'll see it's thankfully a lot more diverse now than it was in the last picture. But these are no longer just people who are going out and exploring the North Pole or the depths of the Amazon. These are scientists, they're engineers, they're educators, they're journalists, they're conservationists. They're anyone who's really planning to make a difference to the world and to build a planet that we can coexist peacefully with other people and with the other wildlife and animals that live here. So we support people through our grants. We've funded around 13,000 grants over our history. We're ramping that up. If anybody wants to know more about the grants that we give, please do come and see me afterwards. But what we want to achieve through the funding that we give is really threefold. So we want to create a society that values both biological diversity but also cultural diversity. We want to speed up innovation for sustainability. I think sustainable development is a theme that runs throughout this conference, and we want to be able to support that where we can. And we want to protect species and ecosystems. And all of this, we hope, will help to produce a planet in balance. So to go to some of my examples, the first one is more cultural diplomacy than science, but I thought it was an interesting one. This is from a National Geographic photographer called Dean Conger. He did many trips to Russia over a period of years. And this is from one assignment that he was on, which was in 1964. So it was the height of the Cold War. It was 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he took photos like this, which are quite iconic, very visual, which were being beamed back, not beamed back then, but put into the living rooms of people across America. But he also put these type of images in as well. So ones that really showed the people, the human side of life behind the Iron Curtain, so that people in America could feel some connection with the people in Russia. And he did these reports over a number of years, and he won an award, a World Understanding Award from University of Missouri. And he used the power of imagery, really, to build connections between different countries and cultures. And this idea of connecting people through images, through science, through exploration, is one that's really important to National Geographic. We want to help us understand each other and where we come from. So this is the second example of a project, and this is not a National Geographic project, but it's one where we've supported one element of the field work. It's also had many other funders, British Academy, Arts and Humanities Research Councils, several people backing this project, which is called the Central Zagros Archaeological Project. So the Central Zagros region spans Iraq and Iran, and this project is a trilateral project between the UK, Iraq and Iran. And this particular photograph is the project team excavating a Neolithic site, which is at Betansor, which is in Iraqi Kurdistan. And this was this year that these photos were taken. So the actual work that they're doing there is really interesting. The region is one of the areas where there was a very early transition between the nomadic hunter-gatherer existence towards a more settled farming existence in communities. And what they're doing is excavating there and seeing what happened during that transition period. It's led by a researcher called Roger Matthews. And in the run-up to this conference, I gave him a ring just to ask him about the project, about working in the region, how it was. And he said, you know, it can be challenging sometimes working in the region, but actually it's really, really beneficial in terms of the knowledge that they produce. And he talked about two things that were really crucial. I think one of them, Dan has kind of very eloquently talked about, which is about the long-term investment. So this is a long-term project. The project is joint between academics in the UK, in Iraq and Iran. They are co-publishing, but they also work very closely with local government officials, with officials from the Museum of Antiquities, with the local universities, with the people from the Betansor village itself. And they couldn't do that if they just did it in one kind of 6-week field trip. Go there, go back. It just wouldn't work. They needed to build up those relationships over the long term, and to really have that mutual respect, I think, between the different partners involved. And the second thing that he talked about was the importance of involving the students. And this is students from universities in all the countries, and often from many other countries who are based there. And making sure that so there are many exchanges within this project, making sure that students are really briefed well on what to expect. And he said that now there's a really, really active social network amongst the students. They all get together on Facebook, and they're building up those connections at that early point in people's careers. Is really important. It helps them professionally, but it also helps to build that international collaborative outlook. So his work, which was really kind of looking at where we came from as a species, a community, how society develops, is also helping now to bridge different cultures. So the last example that I wanted to talk about is the Okavango Wilderness Project. And this is a National Geographic-led project. And it's all about protecting the world-renowned Okavango Delta, which is in Botswana. So the Okavango Delta is in Botswana. It's this region here. It's enormous. It's a really fascinating kind of geological area as well, where the basin is. But it's in Botswana, but it's fed by rivers coming from the highlands of Angola, so the Kubango and the Kuitu. And this region, Angola was really troubled by war, by isolation. Some of these areas are still peppered with landmines, and it's very unexplored. It remains largely unknown, and it's potentially vulnerable, this water source. So what's at stake? The wildlife. So the largest African elephant population exists in the Okavango Delta, but it's also important for people. So there's water and sanitation there for over 1 million people that depend on it. It provides critical ecosystem functions, so climate change, water, livelihoods for the people that live there. There's a regional tourism industry that's worth $900 million. So it's a really critical area to protect. And what the Okavango Wilderness Project does is it starts with the science. So 4,000 miles of the river system have been explored, looking for new species. 24 new species been found and new species to Angola discovered. It's looking at where the species ranges are, so it's found that elephants are in a region where it wasn't thought that they'd go. But it's also documenting threats to the river system, and they could be threats of pollution or badly managed irrigation or hydroelectric projects. And then from that science, it uses the science, the data, the facts to build up the case for protection. And there's now been an MOU with the government of Angola, the Ministry of Environment. And together with the government, together with other partners, conservation partners, NGOs, we're working to build support to have it as a protected area. And this is for the benefit of the wildlife, but crucially, it's also for the benefit of the people that live there. And the science also helps to build up the case for the economic impact that it could have, the potential for tourism, the importance of this water supply to the region. So it establishes the value of the area, and then together, through dialogue with all the partners, it's looking to how you can protect and conserve the area in the future. But for it to have a long-term impact, it has to create a local conservation constituency and a new generation of engaged professionals. So more than, I think around half of the project team are themselves researchers from Angola, Namibia, Botswana. And they work with people from villages, from local conservation projects across the countries. And they're training and employing the next generation of scientists, conservationists, managers. They're building up that human capital that will be needed. And as it was mentioned in a talk this morning, it's really about working from the bottom up. It's not about someone from the US going in and doing this and then leaving. It's about it being driven from the people on the ground. And then finally, there's the aspect of kind of opening hearts and minds. And this is where it kind of circles back a bit to the magazine. Because as well as actually doing the work, doing the science, doing the advocacy, we can then help spread the message through the media channels. So there's an article about the Okavango Delta in the current magazine. There'll be a film made about it. It gets the word spread out much, much further than it would do otherwise, reaching 700 million people around the world. And I just, on that point, wanted to share my final picture, just because this always makes people go, oh. And this is another project that we support called Photo Arc. There's a photographer called Joel Sartori who's trying to photograph every single species which is in animal care somehow, in zoos or in conservation parks. And he's doing this to try to encourage people to do more about saving them. And I just love this picture because it helps remind you how powerful it is simply just to be with someone or an animal and look into their eyes and maybe think about things from their own perspective rather than at a distance. And that brings me to the end of my talk. This is another beautiful photo of Petra, which I found in the archives the other day from 1947. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think you have demonstrated very well with images the value of this cultural diversity. So biodiversity and cultural diversity, which are at the heart of the National Geographic, as you have mentioned, connecting people through images and exploration. So whether it is the Central Zagros Archaeological Project or the Okavango Wilderness Project, these are two, I think, vivid examples of how we can connect people through exploration. You have also highlighted, like Daniel, the value of the co-ownership, so involving local people in the projects and not getting someone from outside to do it for them. Also the long-term impact and sustainability of such actions are very important. Now we move to the third speakers, and this will be jointly, I think this intervention will be joint between Michael and Erica, and I'd like to invite you. Thank you.
Michael's going to use the screen, and I'm going to talk from here.
Get the first slide up.
We good to go? Okay, good morning, everyone. So this all started when the British Council invited WANA to attend a gathering of like-minded scientists to match organisations and to brainstorm potential projects on natural resource diplomacy. So at this stage, WANA wasn't, it was pretty new. So I jumped at the opportunity to go with probably less concern that I should have, that I didn't really know much about water, and I certainly didn't know anything about water diplomacy. And for a non-scientist, this matching event, it was kind of akin to speed dating, with so much technical jargon that it could have been in a foreign language. But then right at the end, there was Michael, who actually made sense to me. So we left, and I kind of chased him, and I think I kind of crash-tackled him, and he was on a bike, and it was a bit awkward. It was raining, but we sat and we talked in the rain, and at the end of that, we vowed that our organisations would work together and use decoupling theory to come up with a diplomatically pragmatic and viable solution to Jordan's water crisis. So soon it was Michael and Nadav from EcoPeace, and luckily Lara stepped up as WANA's resident scientist, because I still didn't really know what was going on, but I was resolute that Michael was on to something amazing. And obviously the British Council did too, because we were one of the few organisations that was awarded what was then called an Institutional Links Grant, and it's now called a STREAM grant, to pursue this really innovative, out-of-the-box way of looking at water problems. So today I know far more about water and agriculture than I ever thought I would, and I also have a much better insight into the role that natural resources can play in forging, perhaps not peace, but certainly mutually beneficial solutions. And when push comes to shove, this is kind of what actually matters. Gone are the days where people like me think the governments are going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. What's more relevant is that Jordan wants to grow its economy. And to grow its economy, it needs to free up water. It needs friendly, stable nations to trade with, and it needs to put in place enabling conditions to attract private sector investment. So it'll take actions in support of this that also promote sustainability, not because it's the right thing to do, but actions that support Jordan's imperatives, development-wise, allow it to do the right thing. So Israel and Palestine are in the same boat. So it's up to us as scientists and development practitioners to present those pathways, because that's the kind of diplomacy that's going to work in this region. So we're going to see how good of a team Michael and I are now, because we agreed to do this tag team, and we only talked about it for about 10 minutes, and all we basically said was that he was going to say all the science stuff and I was going to say whatever I could. But before I hand over to Michael, let me just present the basic idea that was behind this research project. So like many economies in the Middle East, Jordan and Palestine face extreme water scarcity and increasing food insecurity. Israel, which shares a similar geography, has taken policy and technological interventions to largely overcome those challenges, and it's become a global leader in irrigated agricultural production. So we examined how, where, and to what extent those best practices could be shared and transferred between those countries. Decoupling a growing population and its economy from its water use is highly complicated, and it's multidimensional. So we needed to look at what composition of crops went into the trade basket, how wastewater might be rerouted to substitute some of those items, how savings could be efficiently driven to maximise the unit value of water. And this was all taking into account that if the agricultural sector was to downsize, farmers needed alternate, equally gainful livelihood options. So it's not about one solution. It was about lots of small solutions that required all of these sectors that all had different vested interests to speak together around a common goal. And of course, this is where things got highly interesting for us. But I'm going to pass over to Michael now, and he's going to talk about the magical numbers and how we got there. And then he's going to flip back to me for some policy insights. Yep.
Great. Thank you, Erica. So, yeah, we've already mentioned the term decoupling. I want to just flesh that out a little more. So the concept of decoupling, or breaking the link between economic and population growth and water resource needs, is absolutely crucial in understanding how water-scarce economies have and can continue to grow despite their resource limits. And what our research partnership looked at was basically applying this model to Jordan. This was a model that I've developed over the past 5 or so years. It conceptualizes 4, sorry, zoom it. Can I? Okay. Oh yes, I can. Okay, so thank you very much, I've learned something. It conceptualizes 4 mechanisms by which an economy can circumvent its water limits. The first is diversifying the economy away from agriculture, so generating more economic growth in non-water intensive sectors. That's that bit. The second bit is for highly water scarce economies, is importing an increasing percentage of population food needs, so that your agricultural water requirements do not need to grow at the same rate as your population. The third is agricultural water productivity, getting more crop per drop of water applied. And the fourth, oh, I can drag it, this is exciting. The fourth is what I've termed natural water decoupling, which is enhancing your overall available water resource base without increasing your offtake from the freshwater environment. So that basically means seawater desalination and wastewater recycling. Seawater desalination for Jordan is very geographically constrained. Wastewater recycling has significant potential. So those are the 4 mechanisms that are available broadly for any country in the world. As Erica said, Israel has, how do I get onto the next slide? Israel has exemplified this very, very effectively. Jordan has also demonstrably adopted all four of these mechanisms. But our research question was, okay, how can Jordan, what can Jordan and Palestine learn from the Israeli experience? Why is this important? Why this is important is because despite Jordan's tremendous water successes to date, especially with the influx of Syrian refugees, there is a significant water challenge. And that water challenge is best expressed by this graph here. This is a projection of water resource use, of water resource demand, through to 2025. And what we see, sorry, have I lost the translation because I'm not on the microphone? What we see is a deficit between projected demand, available supply, and sustainable supply. Now, the Jordanian government is very aware of this and are pursuing numerous strategies to try and bridge this gap. What our research has aimed to do is to demonstrate an additional strategy drawing on regional best practice. So our work really focused on agricultural water productivity and food trade and wastewater reuse. The economic diversification almost comes as a result of these other 3 mechanisms. Our research used secondary data, using past studies and official government data from Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, and also primary data, namely farmer interviews. And we were basically trying to get comparable data on crop water use and crop production across Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. We think this is the first case where there's been that direct farm level comparable interviews. So our key findings were, if Jordan moved towards Israeli levels of agricultural water productivity, and these are very, very conservative estimates, we reckon that there could be a saving based on current production of between 65 million cubic meters per year and 168 million cubic meters per year. Through enhanced food trade, so increasing import dependency of certain crops which are already import dependent, so arguably not increasing sort of geostrategic risk much beyond current bounds, we reckon a further 50 million cubic meters of water could be saved. Yes, there would be then economic and social impacts in terms of withdrawing agricultural production in certain areas. Jordanian treated wastewater, so the reuse of urban wastewater in agriculture, is actually on a pretty good trajectory. But again, based on the Israeli levels of recycling as a percentage of domestic water use, we reckon that there is a significant increase potential to about just between 40 and 50% additional to what is currently being planned. For Palestine, the data was very, very difficult. Crop data was a massive challenge. We do find clear potential on treated wastewater, namely because there is very little current reuse of effluent in agriculture due to infrastructural and political challenges. But again, our research sort of highlighted that potential. I'm going to skip that. What this means, if we basically plug in that potential 168 million cubic meter saving plus another 50 million cubic meters from waste from food imports, we see it through to 2025. It is, in theory, possible to eliminate the deficit that is anticipated between demand and supply. Thank you. It is possible to eliminate the deficit between future demand and supply. So what we're saying is that due to increased agricultural efficiency, production can grow while agricultural water allocation basically stays static at about 500 million cubic meters per year. That is actually the current allocation. The policy aspiration is to increase that. We're saying that that is not necessary to increase agricultural production. So that's the kind of impact on Jordanian water security. I'm now going to hand back to Erica for some sort of broad diplomacy insights, and then I'm going to cover in a little more detail some of the mechanics that we encountered.
Okay, still after 2 years, Michael, I really didn't get a lot of what you just said. But so technical stuff aside, I've got three main takeaways, and these all concern the locus of diplomatic engagement. So the first thing we found is that the problem isn't between the farmers in Jordan and Israel and them transferring best practices. They get it. They look across the border and they see green. And to the extent they're already doing it, we did a visit of Jordanian farmers, took them over to Israel to observe best practices. I was the only one who was on my first trip there. They had all been before. So they know what they've got to do. They've got a motivation to find a solution, but they need help. They need insurance. They need financing and tax breaks to allow them to invest in the equipment like the Israeli government provided to their farmers. They need timely information that they can trust so that they can stop hacking into the Israeli extension service broadcasting. And they need predictability and reliability in their water access. So the second thing is that it's not even a problem between the governments. The problem in Jordan is getting ministries on board. We're not even getting towards Israel sharing technology or anything like that. This is diplomacy at the sub-national level. So we need to unpack why there hasn't been better institutional uptake on this. So one thing that we're beginning to work out is that these ministries feel that they have been solutioned to death. They are sick of hearing from this high-level university or that Ivy League graduate that has the 1 in a million solution to the Middle East's water problem. These multi-sectorial solutions are complicated, but just because they're science-based, it doesn't mean that they're not highly politicised. So scientists need to get on board with this idea that moving forward doesn't mean that everyone gets the same correct message. It means that everyone gets a message that they understand and that they have a vested interest in supporting. So the other thing we need to do is to be realistic. So the solutions that are most likely going to work are going to involve really tough supply and price reforms. And there just may not be the political momentum at the moment to be able to push that through, not right now. Jordan is facing myriad development challenges. It's got a stagnating economy, it's got critical levels of youth unemployment, it's got conflicts on every border. And with all respect to Ecopeace can say that water cannot wait until it's blue in the face, but nothing is worse than instability and conflict. And the people with ultimate decision-making authority, they know that. So whatever solution we put forward, it needs to be packaged in the language of resilience. But if water security can be presented as a modality to promote resilience, if it can be used as a tool to free up water that Jordan needs to grow its manufacturing sector, if it can be used to create the high-tech jobs that young people want, then this message becomes a game changer. Do I have time for another takeaway? One more? Chair? Yes? Okay, the final thing I wanted to say, and it kind of cuts to the purpose of this grant, which was knowledge partnerships and scientific rationalism as this pathway to diplomacy. And this is wonderful, except that it assumes that there's a presence of a robust and cutting-edge science community. Out of 22 countries in the region, 2 have science academies. There's no science advisor to the Jordanian government. The money for research is meagre. It's around 0.3% compared to 3% in developed countries. And we can see this. You just got to look at the statistics in terms of patents, innovation licenses, peer-reviewed journals in the Arab world compared to the rest. So part of this is the regional economic situation. But another part of it is political commitment, that scientific excellence simply hasn't been a priority for Arab governments in the past. Now, it's not that governments just haven't thought about it or they haven't connected the dots. It's more than that. There's little political commitment to a science community for the same reasons that there's not broader commitment to a knowledge-generating community more generally. Some governments don't want a community of critical, independent, boundary-pushing thinkers because this is inimical to the government's model that maintains the status quo. Okay, this deficit is only going to be remedied when governments see a robust, knowledge-generating community to be within its interests. We can see this happening in KSA at the moment. We can all learn a lesson from this. Cutting-edge science cannot evolve without government support, and is only going to happen when we package it in an agenda that elevates it to the top of theirs. So it's not called cheating, it's just kind of called getting it done. So I'm done. Back to you.
Okay, so hopefully very quickly. Couple of just insights into how we actually managed the partnership. So the first potential challenge we faced was a formal agreement across 3 countries. It's an Israeli organization, EcoPeace, WANA in Jordan, and Oxford. We basically circumvented that by effectively creating 2 multilateral projects. So there was no formal signature between Israel and Jordan. What there was 2 projects working to the same end. The EcoPeace side of things was working in Israel and Palestine. We also recognize the idea that there is an opportunity for 2-way learning, that it shouldn't just be Israeli expertise going to Jordan. There are opportunities to learn the other way, and we've certainly found that in terms of olive crops and dates in terms of water productivity. There's some potential transfer from Jordan to Israel in terms of expertise. UK research is very obsessed, rightly or wrongly, with ethics. Sometimes it can be a real headache to navigate that. The fundamental of sort of UK research ethics is transparency, and I've got to be careful what I say here. We were not being not transparent. We created an ethical framework for the project that allowed us to sensitively describe the project. Because it was 2 multilateral projects, there was no need for us to go out to farmers necessarily and say, yes, we are doing this Israeli Jordanian research. There were contexts where participation and getting data needed to be prioritized, and we need to recognize the sensitivities over throwing farmers and throwing participants absolutely everything we were doing. So there was an ethical leeway into how we described that project, and that was sort of signed off by the university, and that was a very important element of design in terms of building that stakeholder engagement. That said, we also at quite an early stage had cultural resistance on the Jordanian side to engagement with Israel. And one of our meetings, we had a side comment saying, we're not happy. Are there any Israelis present? We cannot be here if there are Israelis present. At that point, it became very clear that our aspiration of having a closing workshop in Amman, bringing together Jordanian, Israeli, and Palestinian policy and agricultural stakeholders was not gonna happen. We restructured our end of project to actually, as Erica mentioned, have an exchange workshop in Israel. This created some significant tensions between EcoPeace and WANA, not necessarily on the political front, but on the sort of operational and political sensitivities within each organization. EcoPeace is an NGO. Its modus operandi, its method of working is to push the boundary, challenge politics, challenge political and social status quo. WANA has a very different structure and operation within the Jordanian political economy, can't operate in the same way. So there was a mismatch in how each organization saw the other in terms of pushing bounds. What we ended up doing was actually having this closing workshop was coordinated by Oxford. The invitations came from Oxford. Jordanian coordination was actually facilitated by a third party on behalf of Oxford. So there was an allowance for sort of political and social and cultural sensitivities there in terms of formal Jordanian engagement with an Israeli knowledge exchange trip. But that from a UK-based scientist, that was a key source of headaches and tension, but one we happily resolved. So finally, next steps in future of the partnership. As Erica's already mentioned, political capacity and social policy relations are absolutely key, and that's something that we're very excited to hopefully look at in the future. We want to enlarge the farmer survey and dig deeper into crop water efficiency and the meaning of efficiency within water scarce context, and that feeds into other elements of the current scientific debate. And finally, long term, I guess there's an aspiration, one always has to dream, of a potential application of this sort of comparative methodology to other parts of the Middle East and North Africa region. Thank you. Our full report of our year's work is available at that URL. The full URL is there, but that shortcut should work. Happy to talk further afterwards. Thank you.
You want to tell me? Yeah, thank you. I have the video, yes. Thank you very much for Erica and Michael's. I think this marked a transition, first from cultural diplomacy to science diplomacy. And what a topic, water diplomacy. I think in this part of the world, water diplomacy is of utmost importance. It's also interesting, the connection between science and politics, but I have to say that in the region, nothing is surprising. I don't think that it's only surprising or was only difficult and sensitive because we're dealing with Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. In the Gulf region, right now, everything is politicized. So science is also politicized with other countries, including neighbors and brothers. So investing in science for development is a very important topic. I think how governments can really, I don't think that the Arab governments are not aware of the importance of investing in science. It is just that knowledge generation and knowledge localization in the Arab region is what's needed, meaning that there was a lot of technology transfers coming from abroad and paid for, but this is not sustainable. Now, how can the region generate its own knowledge and build on its own knowledge? I think this is the area where science diplomacy is important, but this knowledge has to be localized in the region and not just transferred from abroad against a fee, which is what's happening, to be honest. Now we come to the last presentation of the day, and it's a video message from Michael Byers. So.
If I can manage to get it up. Is it on video? It is on here. Just let's hope this works.
Hello, my name is Michael Byers, and I am a professor of international law and international politics at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. I'm pleased to join you today to talk about international scientific cooperation in two frontier regions, outer space and the Arctic. Let me start with the Arctic. The Arctic has been a front line in the Cold War, a place that saw nuclear missile submarines sailing under the Arctic sea ice, that saw nuclear-armed bombers flying overhead. It was very much a place of potential confrontation during the Cold War. But at the same time, there was an emergence of international cooperation, starting first and foremost with science. In 1982, the Soviet Union joined with other Arctic countries, especially Canada, in negotiating provisions in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that related directly to the Arctic. One of those concerned pollution prevention jurisdiction in ice-covered waters, Article 234, and another, Article 76, concerned the rights of coastal states to continental shelves, extending to the outer limit of the natural prolongation of the continental shelf. And this provision, Article 76, included criteria that were based directly on science, on geology, on bathymetry, on oceanography. And these provisions that were adopted in 1982 have provided a foundation for cooperation for scientists between Canada, Russia, the United States, Denmark, and Norway, as they have sought to identify the outer limits of these continental shelves and to provide submissions to a United Nations Commission on the limits of the continental shelf. And this process is continuing to this day. In 1990, the Arctic countries came together to create an international committee on Arctic science that 6 years later gave rise to the Arctic Council, an international forum involving all of the Arctic countries, plus the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, in a gathering that is focused heavily on pollution prevention, on sustainable development, and first and foremost on scientific cooperation. Through various working groups, they have contributed, among other things, to the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, an absolutely pivotal document that chronicled the rise of climate change impacts in the Arctic with implications worldwide. And then just this year, the Arctic countries came together and adopted an international agreement, a treaty on Arctic scientific cooperation. So this process continues. And it has continued not just during and after the Cold War, but through the very heightened tensions that have arisen as a result of the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. The Arctic has remained a place of peace and cooperation, first and foremost on science that has managed to separate itself from tensions elsewhere. The same is true of outer space. In 1975, the Apollo Sputnik project saw an American capsule meet up with a Soviet capsule, joining up, opening up the hatches so that a very famous handshake could take place between astronauts from NASA and cosmonauts from the Russian Space Agency. And scientific cooperation began in space at that moment and has continued through the end of the Cold War, through to the construction of the International Space Station, very much an American, Russian-led effort, creating a laboratory in microgravity that is of enormous utility for scientific experimentation and discovery involving many countries from around the world. This cooperation also continues in terms of Russian rockets being used to launch scientific satellites from, among others, the European Space Agency. The entire Sentinel series of Earth observation satellites from the European Space Agency is being launched significantly on Russian rockets. This cooperation continues not just in the International Space Station today, where at this moment, as you and I sit, Russian and American astronauts and cosmonauts are partnered just 250 kilometers above us, conducting scientific experiments, expanding the extent of human knowledge, forgetting about political tensions on Earth, cooperating in science to advance humankind's reach, both here on Earth and into the galaxies. And just this year, NASA and Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, announcing that they would partner in the development of a lunar orbiting space station to provide the next step forward, to actually have an international place positioned just off of the moon that could provide a launch pad for exploration of that moon of planet Earth, but also for further exploration of planets like Mars. So space cooperation, Arctic cooperation, grounded in science, with the knowledge that science is by definition international, that science is something that is about truth, not politics. And that, of course, is what you are doing at this conference, exploring the importance of this science. And my message to you is keep at the front of your mind the fact that in difficult, dangerous, expensive frontier regions like Arctic and outer space, that countries have been doing this for an awfully long time, reaching across the divides of the Cold War, reaching across tensions in places like Ukraine and Crimea, to come together in pursuit of the truth through science. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to join you.
لأننا نؤمن في مؤسسة عبد الحميد شومان بأهمية الابتكار والإبداع في تلبية احتياجاتنا وإيجاد حلول عملية.
So I think with this last video presentation, we also showed that there is very strong cooperation still between American and Russian scientists in space. Let's hope that they also cooperate on Earth, because it's more concrete maybe. Now that we've listened to different examples of, I think that the way that the order of our presentations was quite interesting. We started, of course, with the British Council, because they are the organizers of the sessions. I think Dan laid down let's say the mixed culture and science diplomacy that the British Council engages in, and then Claire moved to culture diplomacy of National Geographic, which is quite vivid by images. And then we moved to quite a hard science and quite a topical theme. There is the water diplomacy, particularly in the region, very rightfully so when we are here in Jordan. And then we listened about the Arctic cooperation in science. So from all these examples, it's quite obvious that we need the scientists to engage in this cooperation. Otherwise, science or cultural diplomacy, we need the people, we need the subject to engage. One first thing maybe I have referred to before is, yes, we need to link these people, but do we also need these top-down programs, or we can just have it bottom-up approach? And I would like to start by maybe throwing this question at the panelists to say from their experience, and also not only, I mean, yes, you can say we need both, but how well does this work? Meaning working with governments or agencies or funding agencies or program owners to have this top-down and working with the people. Does it always work, or what is, in your experience, the challenges that are encountered? And until the panelists answer this question, I would like to invite you also to think of what you would like to ask them to answer. Maybe we'll start this time with Claire.
So in terms of the top-down, bottom-up approach, I think, as you pointed out, you actually need both. You can't have one without the other, I think. And so my experience is actually more from the British Council perspective. So thank you, Dan, for letting me go first. But one thing that was found in the Newton Fund that was really crucial was the very starting point, working with national partners to define the priorities. So not just defining priorities from one side and then coming in and saying, okay, how are you going to help us achieve those priorities? But really together defining those priorities and using that as a starting point, even if sometimes it threw up things that maybe were not top of mind. So if I think about Brazil, there was a project which the Brazilian government really wanted to pursue, which hadn't been anything that had been thought of from the UK end, but because it was very high priority, we explored how we could make that possible, and achieved a really interesting partnership there. So I think from the top down, it needs to be top down on an equal partnership, and from the first. But then you need the scientists themselves to be able to identify what the problems are, and I think. In the UK, there's also something called the Haldane Principle, which is it kind of makes a distinction between the government policy, who define the wider priorities, and then the actual scientists saying what the science needs to be and what the best science is and who should be funded. So peer review deciding who's funded out of the larger initiatives. So I probably haven't exactly answered your question there, but
no, you did actually. Just I was asking about if there were like challenges encountered there. I think in this area, I mean, Claire and Michael have maybe focused on the challenges that they working with governments and working with subjects. Here they were farmers, whether they are farmers or scientists, and working with the governments. It was different. I mean, when you're dealing only with the farmers, scientists, or you're dealing with the governments, clearly there are challenges that you faced, right? Maybe Michael would...
Necessarily, you've got something. I am not sure I'm necessarily going to directly address that. Yes, so yes, there are challenges. There are different kinds of challenges relating to, say, stakeholders and society versus government, just as there are also challenges experienced by government in relating and engaging to those very same stakeholders. If I can just backtrack a minute and possibly, Claire, tangentially pick up on something you said. I think one thing that was quite powerful about the British Council call that we responded to was the ideational mix of top-down and bottom-up. The British Council kind of set a very broad agenda. It was then up to the research community, namely us applying for this for the grant, to come up with a sort of workable proposal, and one where we felt there was a scientific need, but I think also from Juana's perspective, very much a political and social need. So it was very much that fusion of like large agenda with what we identify as the need. And then I think our position as researchers has been grappling with those two different directions, namely that we're sort of sitting in the middle between high-level policy and stakeholders, and kind of both matching our research, but also engaging both sort of upstream and downstream. Again, I don't think that directly.
You were acting as facilitators, right?
Yes, facilitators, but also, I don't know, hopefully long-term influencers as well. Yeah.
I mean, I'd only just add the really important role which is played by different types of actors in politically sensitive contexts. Like, so WANA, as I guess quite a politically robust think tank in Jordan, was able to participate in an engagement like this and to undertake very valuable research from a Jordanian perspective. But certainly engaging in a research agenda or a research methodology that the Jordanian government could never do. Like, let's be clear, they would never pursue this, but they can benefit from it at the same time. So different roles can be played in bottom-up and top-down ways that benefit all parties, but it's just being able to navigate politically who can do what to feed into a broader agenda that serves everybody's interests. And I think that's important for people who are coordinating research grants to appreciate and be able to understand and to link up those actors.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to maybe come back to Mike, or related to this becoming actors point of becoming actors in this game. I think scientists also, what I find interesting, scientists become actors, and they need to be willing to be that. STREAM as a program has this implicit science diplomacy element in it. We don't talk about it that much. We talk about the topic area, but de facto there's an instrumental idea behind that, in that we want to link up these countries through something that's important to the entire region, and do that via science. And I think scientists participating may then sometimes feel that they're being used for something like a higher level agenda, if you want to call it that. But in our experience, it's worked really well for scientists are willing to engage as political actors. They are inadvertently political actors through that, and they step beyond their role as just scientists. And I think that's an important thing. If you see science as part of culture, as part of society, you come with your own heritage, your own background. A UK scientist always represents the UK automatically, even if they don't necessarily come from the UK in terms of their family backgrounds and so forth. Just look at me. I think that's one of the most important messages that I've drawn from many of these things. And just to go back to your question in terms of bottom up, top down, it depends. I would think it totally depends on the setup. Just going back to the examples I gave earlier, in some contexts it would not work bottom up. So in Russia, we wouldn't have been able to do any of the exchanges we supported had there not also been some level at a certain time. So it's also temporal dimension to that, political dimension, without some level of buy-in from government and almost sign-off from government. The Iranian example I showed operates more bottom up. So I think it really does depend, and all actors again need to be, including the universities, need to be able to navigate that and be aware that these things are complex, interacting situations.
Thanks, Dan. I think you also pointed out a very important issue, which, in my own experience, working in let's say, managing science and managing research internationally. The problem is that, like you said, scientists not always are politically minded. And they sometimes need to be politically sensitized to be able to deal with across-border cooperation. On the other hand, also politicians should be, of course, scientifically minded in order to be able to allow for this to happen and let's say, be conducive, put the conducive environment for this cooperation to happen. So cross-sensitization between politicians and scientists is needed in science diplomacy somehow, and this is where bottom-up and top-down become very important. I would like to give the chance to our audience also to ask some questions. We will take a few questions, and then we will ask the panelists to respond. So if you just please, we have here another one if you need although the room is small, I don't think you need two, but just before asking your question, just introduce yourself, please. And yes, the back here, and in the front, the lady in the front.
Hello, my name is John Malone. I'm from the University of Connecticut and also a member of the Global Young Academy. We have a small program called the Young Scientist Ambassador Program, where we try to bridge international gaps in scientific training and capacity building. It's a small program, and I'm eager to try and gain some more insight from these larger projects, because the same goal is there, is to try and do science between different cultures, different countries, in order to normalize relations, in order to have a cultural exchange. And on the one hand, I see the value in these giant mega projects where everybody can be galvanized and focus on one common goal that benefits everybody. But what can we do as a smaller organization to try and feed into those things and be efficient, sort of from a bottom up, where we don't have the resources to kind of have these mega projects?
Could you pass on the mic to the lady in front of you?
Hi, my name is Lara Nassar. I'm a senior researcher with the WANA Institute. I just wanted to maybe point out something extra on what everybody was talking about. So from experience in Jordan, we are stuck in what I want to call pilotitis, the disease of what I want to call pilotitis, the disease of creating pilots that are never upscaled because of two reasons. There are huge gaps in wanting to upscale this stuff because we either work bottom up and never work from the top bottom. And I think we need to find a new way of wanting to create these new projects that can move past the pilot stage. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges in Jordan. We have all of these amazing ideas. We actually try them on the ground and they work, but nothing gets upscaled. And I think the combination of both and creating ownership not only with the local community as a civil society, but we also need to create ownership when it comes to policymakers. Policymakers need to feel accountable for their decisions and or their missed opportunities, if I want to say. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Doesn't have to be a question, it could also be a comment if you... Okay. So we'll move now to the panelists to comment on these two, let's say, two questions or comments. First, how can the small organizations also plug into these projects, not necessarily having of course, the enormous funds that British Council might have, and how can they plug in these science diplomacy projects? Particularly, they have their own small programs, right? And the second, which is interesting, this I think in this part of the world, not only in Jordan, I'm sure I'm speaking for the whole part of the world. Usually, initiatives are done in isolated islands, and then you can get another policymaker or another boss who would repeat the same initiative somewhere else. So it's not only pilots that are not upscaled, but also activities that are done and redone, and a lot of redundancy without looking at the impact of course, joining forces. Let's say this is important. So I would like to invite you, since we have 10 minutes left, so if there are no further questions, I would like to take these two, and another one which could be maybe a concluding question from my side is, we've listened to each other, we've listened to, I think, quite interesting and successful programs of culture or science diplomacy, but how can we take this further? What next? What can we build from all our experience here together, from our collective experience? How can we build upon this and maybe have a futuristic look towards how we can use science to improve cultural relations between nations? So we will start, maybe I will leave Dan to the end, because I would like you to have the final words. Not that I'm, you see, I'm trying to be more nicer to you. So we will start from the other end of the table, from Michael. Again, comment on any of these comments that were raised by the audience, and please attempt to answer this. How can we build upon what we've heard from each other?
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess my comment to how can we build further, and the issue of sort of how can a small organisation contribute to cultural diplomacy. I think my comment is probably best summed up in terms of, I think, and I would say this as a researcher, the focus needs to be on the science. I think the key is getting researchers, policy, stakeholder communities together for a common scientific aim. Through carrying out that science, you will build cultural relations. So the cultural relations will be needed to carry out that science, but they would also be an outcome. And I think, yeah, I think, and I think in order to carry out the research, there needs to be an allowance, obviously, for cultural and political sensitivities, and therefore it's important not to, I don't want to use this term negatively, but not to obsess with kind of, yes, building cultural relations and promoting that over and above research. I think getting successful research will lead to improved cultural relations, and I think that is the order things need to be structured, and I think that needs to be very much borne in mind in terms of moving forward, and that sort of dichotomy of inputs and outputs. Yeah.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, I can't more strongly reiterate what Michael has said. I think trying to package stuff up as science when it's really about diplomacy is just asking for trouble. But if you can get people excited around evidence-based solutions to shared problems, of course you're going to set those wheels in motion. I think that's just a logical way of going about things. I'm not sure if this is really going to answer the comment. It's certainly not the most efficient one, but just from a managerial perspective, this grant that we participated in, which brought together our Israeli stakeholders, Michael from Oxford, and WANA, like, don't underestimate just the profound impacts it can have on an individual level. I mean, WANA is a think tank. We employ young, smart Arab graduates from throughout the region. It's an interdisciplinary environment, and this was a tough learning process for us, but like, Michael is now kind of part of the woodwork. He floats in, he comes over from Israel, Lara floats out. We have all got on board with this, and I think for all of us as a think tank community to have gone through a very profound learning process of the diplomatic sensitivities and how we can engage and to become friends with these other scientists across the border, like, it really has been significant. And that was not something that, I anticipated at the beginning of this, but it's changed all our thinking.
First of all, to your question about the Global Young Academy. I think that young scientists in particular need much more than just the funding. They need the wider support networks that you can help to provide. So through bringing them into that global community, through giving them connections, maybe having informal or formal mentoring networks, that in itself is really, really valuable. And also letting them know about the opportunities, because lots of people, there's so many different funders around. I mean, people probably didn't know that National Geographic gave grants to young scientists. They might not know about that. Letting them know that they can apply for British Council, National Geographic, other global opportunities, and helping them kind of navigate that, so that you don't necessarily need to be giving a huge amount of the funding, but you help them access that. And then through that, also connecting up with other networks, other organisations, I think is really, really important. Then onto your point about pilotitis, I think is a really good point. And I think the Okavango project is actually a really good example in this respect, because so we give funding to a lot of explorers, a lot of grantees, and then some of them, then we sort of identify that it might be worth investing more in those. So Steve Boyce, who was the leader of the Okavango, started out on a relatively smaller grant, doing one expedition, but then it grew. And it really started absolutely from the science. So it was really about what is the science that we need to know. We don't know about this river system, about what's there. But then, of course, there's then what's the long-term impact you want to have, and how you're going to get that. And you're not going to get that through the science alone. And so you have to be working with the policymakers and thinking about the very long term, training up the people who will be responsible for this in the long term. But I guess you do need to have a few pilots to be able to identify which one is the relevant one. You just have to make sure that you're not just doing only pilots, and there has to be somehow a channel through which you can scale up the ones which you want to invest in. And I think for us as well, which has evolved obviously since the beginnings of National Geographic, in terms of going forward, we're always saying for our grants that you have to be working with collaborators in the country where you're doing the research. And so back to the Young Academy, we need to be helping to build up those connections at every level, I think.
Thanks, Claire, for stealing all my points. No, I can't claim that, but I fully agree with you that also perhaps a focus on the next generation is really key to this all, and really thinking about scientists, or instilling that perception that scientists are cultural beings, are part of society. It's not only about science. They have this responsibility to contribute to their own societies, but also globally to the shared problems, and generating these internationalized scientists, the next generation. And I think we all also as funders have a responsibility, if we think also about primary, secondary, tertiary education. I think there's this responsibility that we need to generate global citizens. And this is kind of a buzzword to some extent, but I think there's something behind that as well. And even with so if we all in our own spaces contributed to that conceptually, and keep reiterating that we don't exist in isolation as individuals, but also not as countries, as all interdependent, and then embedding that in our systems, the way we shape careers for scientists, for technicians, for politicians, and so forth. I think that's really crucial. In terms of the small amounts of funding, much of what I showed, Newton aside, these are small activities. So some of these Iranian workshops, these were £5,000, £10,000 a piece. These are initial steps, and I think with these kind of seeding these linkages, in particular, well, we were bringing together early career researchers from both sides, with a tiny amount of money. But these people will then go on, maybe they'll stay in academia, maybe they won't, but they will remember these links that have been made, and the personal links as well. And I think there's an amplification effect as well. And if you then bring in a mentoring angle to that, I think that can be quite productive. yeah, I think that really was what I wanted to say. It's really this holistic approach that we need to see science as part of society, and that's not, I mean, obviously like a new idea, but scientists have a responsibility. It's not just a profession. You are embedded in society. You are a political being, perhaps per se, and then the global angle to that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will attempt very quickly to just highlight a few words from these closing remarks, because I liked very much when Michael said that the focus should be on science. And let's not really be distracted from this. The focus should be on science. I've always said that science diplomacy initiatives should be labeled in retrospect. Not, we don't create a program now and we call it, this is a science diplomacy program, and we start with it. Because in retrospect, when these programs achieve this rapprochement between the two cultures and different nations, and help and have an impact, then we call it science diplomacy. And I think this may be one way to avoid not focusing on the science, but rather focusing on the diplomacy of it, or the political will. Networks are very important, yes. Creating networks is maybe, this is where you should start from. I totally agree. And so creating, supporting networks, and activating the networks based on, of course, cooperation with the locals in the area which you want to work on. The co-ownership is also very important. Yes, science is, I mean, scientists should be regarded as part of the society, or through a holistic approach. They should be also regarded as global citizens, hopefully. They can act as ones, but then again, we need to have these scientists who are more involved in again, scientists who are a bit politically sensitized. And maybe these should not work as scientists, but rather as managers of these programs or facilitators. Because this part of the world also, what we lack is, we get a very good scientist, move him or her from the lab, and let them handle a funding program, for example. So we lose them in the lab, and probably they are not very good managers, so we lose them also in the program. Where we have to build, and I was astonished that no one mentioned this, we have to build this group of managers who would manage science and innovation, and not only we have the scientists and the policymakers. This group is in the middle, and I think they are very important. Again, I would like to highlight what Daniel said. Maybe this is the last remark. It's not all about the funds. Some funds are very small, but they create very important links. And sometimes you link those scientists and you forget them, and many years pass, and then you come and look back and you find them working together in different programs. They look for funds and they do the job. So links are very important. Links, links, and links. I would like to thank very much our distinguished panelists. I think we had a very vibrant panel, let's say, presentations and interventions today. Although, of course, we all suffered from the breakdown of the sessions, so the sessions are small, but I hope that you have something to take home, at least some messages from this panel. Again, I would like to thank the British Council for organizing this session, and Royal Scientific Society and the organizers of the World Science Forum. I wish you all pleasant remaining of the day. I think this is the last day, and those who are going on trips tomorrow, hope you enjoy your sightseeing, and hope to see you again maybe in the next World Science Forum. Thank you.